can I bounce an idea off you? Um,
Absolutely.
the idea I'm going to bounce off you is the discontinuity between the reality and the pop culture consensus.
Sure.
And that's something that kind of dogs us with anything to do with any of these topics. In this case, the notion that there was a thing called Dungeons and Dragons and that it invented role playing, and then everybody played that, and then little by little by little, the topics diversified and the companies diversified, and then role playing kind of got bigger, took on different shapes, and then there was kind of the internet, and then that turned into a broader expansion and a kind of an indie explosion and a sort of post industry spray of
Sure.
things, and then everybody takes sides about whether this is good or bad or something like that. And anybody who's
Yeah,
played
there's a lot
something,
of drama out there
well,
over this stuff.
well, part of it's all based on the fact that none of that history is true, that the early history was itself an explosion, and I think an explosion of both design principles and topics, and very integrated with comics and science fiction and kind of the underground culture of the time, and
Sure.
that it was largely kind of effaced and forgotten by the mid 80s. And so things that weren't beta at all, in fact, things that I would consider distinctly alpha compared to Dungeons and Dragons itself, which rapidly became pastiche of itself within very few years. Um, that those things were not beta. They were not, secondary or follow the leader or anything of the kind. The industrial, or rather the hobby infrastructure of distributorships and things like that played a big role with it, among other things. But what I'm saying is that the grassroots explosion and experimentation with role playing has been ongoing the entire time. And
Sure.
that you can see pieces of it sort of claw their way into visibility. I can give a dozen examples, but appropriate to my seminar tonight is Marvel Superheroes in the early 80s,
Oh yeah.
which is
I
a
love that
perfect,
game.
yeah, and everybody does because it's very, very good. And
Yeah.
and it was also continuously played after its release, and when it went out of print, continuously played anyway, and no one ever saw that or realized it until, a decade later with the internet, or more than a decade later with the internet.
Sure.
So I guess what I'm saying is that if we have this pop culture consensus that there was this Dungeons and Dragons thing, and everybody thinks of it as this fad that only kind of creepy people did for a little while, in a very marginal way afterwards, after the fad, and that somehow it's hip again, and etc. If you kind of buy into that narrative, then pretty much everything else one might want to say about the currently available games today and their range is kind of undercut. You kind of like lost your best case right there
Absolutely.
for explaining what we're looking at right now. My claim is that the internet didn't permit all this publication and innovation and experimentation and argumentation. It permitted the argumentation,
Yes.
but rather that all that was going on the whole time, and that
Yeah.
emerged for those who kept looking. It emerged routinely, and only very few of those things managed to gain hobby traction. But that's because the hobby was economically and socially, frankly, not very good at picking up cool new things. I mean,
Right.
counterintuitively, geek culture, I think, is kind of hidebound and kind of self-referential and often kind of illiterate. I mean, it's a terrible thing to
Well,
say,
yeah,
but they
this
kind of are.
stuff happens a lot
Yeah. Hmm.
in the gaming communities. It seems very early on, if we're talking about D&D and pre D&D, uh, those people, there seemed to be a small knit group of very educated, very well read, individuals that started engaging in this
Hmm.
this what would become the hobby, as it were.
Greg
And then
Stafford,
once
M.A.R. Barker.
right,
Yeah.
right,
Hmm.
all those folks, and then when you launch past that, by the time you get to Metamorphosis Alpha and beyond, when it gets popularized, as it were, it seems like there's a cultural shift amongst gamers, or at least it's
Yeah.
engaging maybe a culture that was already there that starts paying attention to role playing games.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing to talk about, and almost a lot of people I've talked about are really interested in it kind of from a sociological point of view. I like to point, I don't have a theory, about this. I don't have a
Sure.
truly coherent notion about it. I do know there are a couple of important signposts. One was the shift of Trek fandom from basically a counterculture to a fandom culture. I mean, you could call the previous Star Trek fans, and they sure as hell were, but they were very
Sure.
much a countercultural type of fandom, and I mean that in a very technical sense.
Yeah.
Um, and then if you shift to after the first movie and into certainly for the next generation, but in that trajectory, you see a completely different shift into what being into Star Trek even meant. You see the same thing. I like to talk about how fantasy becomes recursive, how it begins around 1981, but by 1989, the fantasy books are written because they're confirming what gaming fantasy is like. And the gaming fantasy is being written because that's the kind of books it's based on. So you get, all the way from Dragonlance, like early Dragonlance is kind of more linear. It's like, look, we got gaming stuff, let's make books out of it, more or less. And then, regardless of quality. And you also see things like that with Thieves World and stuff like that. And then certainly by the beginning of the Forgotten Realms, and then finally, as I like to say, kind of reaching the apotheosis in the Wheel of Time, you can't tell whether it's a gaming source book or a novel anymore, and that's exactly the way people want it. With
Right. Yeah. It's like that multimedia track that
right,
started exploding where everything gets connected. If a game comes out, there's a book for it,
right,
there's a
right.
movie about it, etc.
The as we like to say, the novel of the movie about, from the novel by so and so, and Fred
Right.
Saberhagen's, Francis Ford's Coppola's, Bram Stoker's Dracula. Um,
Yep.
so I mean, I sound like a bit of a snob in this. I do want to say that without being too snobby, that it can be identified at least as a phenomenon. And
Sure.
even just drag my unwanted opinion out of the picture. The phenomenon, I think, is real. So those are all contexts for kind of what we're talking about. Um, so okay, but what does this have to do with your talk? What I'm saying is let's take a look at what the medium of role playing afforded to people like Barker and Stafford and a wide variety of rather startling talents. If we go to art, people like Liz Danforth,
Hmm.
or Dave Trampier for that matter, all kinds of people who really, I hope I'm not upsetting anybody by saying this, but really could have been doing something else. and
Sure. Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
and
I think
so
that's very fair to
yeah,
say.
and so what did this medium afford them? What did they see in it? And let's just make sure that if hobby culture has missed that on and off here and there, that let's not miss it ourselves. What role playing offers to an audience like you're talking about isn't really what it offers to somebody who identifies as a gamer.
Absolutely.
Right. So your thoughts on that are really welcome to me. I'm very interested in that.
Yeah, well, so the whole context of the situation I'm going to be in and why I've chosen the audience that I have is because this is a science fiction fantasy festival,
Uh-huh.
right? So it's kind of like a mini con. And there are going to be artists there, and there are going to be vendors there, and there's going to be comic books there, all the stuff you would associate it with it. And it's at our local Hoover Library here in Alabama, which is like a mini mall. It's one of
Hmm.
the largest in the Southeast, definitely the most, I think it is the largest in the Southeast and the most visited. So it's a kind of a crazy coming in and doing this. So, so yeah, I really want to connect to those particular people that are coming, because while there will be gamers there, there will be people that identify as gamers there. There's going to be a lot of people there. Dungeons and Dragons gets super popular right now.
Right.
So so yeah, that's what they've seen. Like, I get new customers in my store almost every day that are like, hey, I'm kind of interested in Dungeons and Dragons. How do I get started? So that's kind of really what I want to focus is getting a hold
Yeah.
of these people and saying, hey, I know you're super interested in this. Let me tell you a little bit more about it.
I know it may have sounded a little dismissive, but it sounds as though we're going to try and find the best of both worlds, the best of kind of the commerce and hobby based role playing scene, and the best of the interests of people out there,
Sure.
and kind of pop them together if possible. From my writings, and obviously you have your thoughts on what I might have to offer on this, but from my writings, I think the most important thing is to understand what the medium itself is. That,
Sure.
and I run into this all the time. The notion that we have not a not just a venue or set of instruments for some medium that we already know. For example, playing a board game, or for example, watching a movie or enjoying a novel. um, that this isn't just a venue for doing that. This isn't like just saying, well, I saw the movie, so now I'm going to read the book, or, I play this board game, so now I can play that board game. This is actually a jump into a completely different medium whereby author and audience. I mean, I don't know if you saw I pointed you to the phenomenology videos, but,
Oh yeah,
if,
I watched them all,
oh, you did. Okay. So no,
beginning to end.
wow, I appreciate that. The first one really is what I'm trying to get at here. The strange notion that we really are talking about folk fiction for the first time in any of our cultural experience. I mean, we're used to fiction always being transitive from author to audience, and also always being product, something that is commodified. And even without getting all romantic and saying we need to get back to the non-commodified thing, back to the golden age before there was money or any of that crap. I'm not doing that. Right. I'm saying more. I'm not going into that zone of analysis. I'm just saying this is a phenomenon that we have not had experience with. That we don't. That's why the word story is an endless source of strife. It just
Sure.
doesn't apply in this new medium. All the anchoring variables that people are used to with the word story are not in the same places. So therefore, it's kind of interesting. You can say, well, that the actual activity really is a different medium, and it is wide open to whatever enjoyable purpose you might want to put it. And that's the first things first for me, is to say you can't say what the point is because we're only talking about a medium. So we can't get distracted by the purpose because of all the possible purposes, unlike nearly any activity known to humans where the purpose is probably really nicely fixed.
Mm-hmm.
Here we have something where it's not. It's just medium. And then second, it's not topic. I mean, at the general level, it's not topic dependent. I mentioned this in the videos too, that comics have finally managed to convince everybody, even its own fan base, that comics does not mean a specific topic. That you can
Right.
have
Yeah.
comics with any topic. And, even as early as 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when McLeod first published Understanding Comics, that was really hard to get across. You couldn't
Yeah,
convince
I
anybody.
actually wrote a paper on that
Yeah,
book when I was in graduate school.
yeah, yeah. Well,
It was a great read.
yeah, but the idea being that he had to go through a whole chapter. His whole first chapter is about, look, it doesn't have to be about Batman. Okay? I mean, it can be
Right.
about anything. And he said, and now everybody's going to have a fit. And he was right. They did. Well, it's the same thing here. All we're talking about is a medium. We don't know what the purpose is except whatever it is we do with it. and we don't know what the topic is except whatever it is we do with it. So that's a pretty that's a those are two really huge dials to spin, you know, and
Yeah,
not anchor down. So it's
yeah, that's
yeah,
a fantastic point, and I definitely want to open up with
yeah,
something akin to that at the very beginning because people so closely associate role playing games with Dungeons and Dragons or Fantasy D20,
right,
Pathfinder sort of
right,
stuff, and I definitely want to present the concept. Hey, that's one very
right,
small flavor. Here's one avenue you can go down. There's so much more.
right. Well, it's kind of interesting because one, of course, it's difficult to do that. I'm sure you can, but the as I have run into many times, the slightest hint of perceived criticism or you know diminution of the beloved topic is interpreted as an attack. And so,
Oh
in
yeah.
many cases, by those who are committed to that, who do identify it with role playing. But to get back to the immediate problem, which is then the next question is, well, okay, this is all well and good, but the word medium is so freaking vague, you know? I mean, what is that?
Mhm.
Medium, isn't that something they said in art class, you know? I mean, and so the question, of course, is what does it look like? How do you do it? What are they doing? I mean, is it defined by rolling these dice? Is it defined by whether my character lives or dies? Is it defined by looking up charts? I mean, that's what visibly that's what you see. You see the rolling of the dice. You see people looking up a given reference point in the text. You see it's sometimes, unfortunately, it's almost more visible when it breaks down slightly, so that it may seem to an observer as though they spent their whole time arguing, when from my point of view things broke for about, not broke, but things were softened or had to be smoothed for a bit, as we all sort of reoriented ourselves as to where our characters were at the moment, or something like that. I mean, we're dealing
Yeah.
with a medium that doesn't have a mechanical object. It's not like tuning the set. You actually do have to do it through talking. When wait a minute, I thought your elf was behind the curtain. No, no, remember I jumped out from there a couple rounds ago. Oh shit, yeah, you did.
Hmm.
Okay, 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 back up, back up. Yeah, never mind that. Okay, instead, stuff like that. And that's frankly, that's no big deal. It's no different than any other creative endeavor with a group of people operating as contributors. You're going to have that kind of, adjustment, of the relationship, what's going on all the time, or not all the time, but a lot. So that's no big deal.
Sure.
The But to an observer, that may look as though some kind of breakdown, or they may have a disproportionate interpretation of that.
I have a
Yeah.
very unique perspective because
Hmm.
of having a game and comic book store and running
Right.
regular RPG events with the general public coming in. Yeah, just watching them engage with a table of role players standing over them, seeing what they're doing. If they've never seen that before, that's a mystery to
Oh
them.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's usually two reactions at that point. They'll go, "Well, that's another world. I have no
Whoa.
idea what's
Right.
going on there," or
Right.
"Wow, that's fascinating. What's this about?"
Man, there's your opening to your talk right there. Just describing what you just described. I mean, saying, look, there are
Yeah,
these two reactions, and and then I bet you'll see every, I, I'm sure you can anticipate you're going to watch everybody in the audience nod, identifying with one or the other.
the
So
division.
yeah, I bet. So
Right.
so this whole idea though of how is this medium engaged in, and my answer to this is really demonstrated by my recent game of Monster Hearts. And
Oh
so
yeah.
I've got 3 sessions up now, and they are not smooth sessions. I'm not the GM, I'm a player. And they're not smooth sessions, but if you settle down and are in it for the haul, you will see everything start to come together, particularly because we do have a brand new role player in there who was
Sure.
thoroughly unfamiliar with the medium. And so, and yet completely engaged, completely ready to contribute, no reluctance at all.
Mhm.
But what a contribution even was, and how it related to things like systemic resolution, mechanical resolution, and things like that. Um, the difference between simply describing in static form the situation and your character's feelings without the context of saying what the character does, and then wondering, well, he played, right? He told us something. And then we're
Sure.
kind of like, what, and we're confused. That's the most important point, especially in that first session. The way I like to put it is this. If we're talking about fiction with characters and a location. I mean, it'll be real basic, right? We're gonna be playing, Metamorphosis Alpha. We're gonna be, just because you mentioned that one. And we have characters, we have a location. Really, the only point of this shared medium is to have time enter the fiction, for the fiction to suddenly be imbued with time, that it can things happen. There are events, and the events have consequences. The events have an impact on what we now work with. My character took damage. I have to play my character differently in some way, even if the game is very sketchy in this regard. And all I know is that, okay, I can only take one more hit, even if nothing else changes about playing the character. And as you probably know, in many games, when that happens, the player will ham it up a little bit. They will have the character limp, even though the rules
Oh
don't
yeah.
say your movement is reduced. They will do stuff like that. Sometimes the rules have that stuff, sometimes they don't, but we are interested when we play, for the most part, about the fiction having cause and effects in fictional time.
Yeah. Right.
So everything we do, all that other stuff, I mean everything, in fact, this is what I call system, is to keep that going without too much confusion. And this is where people get a little bit difficult, because they agree with me on that. And then they say, well, that's good. If only we have a rule for every contingency, confusion will be diminished. And that's where I diverge. And I say, actually, that's not really the source of the confusion. The source of the confusion is not arguing about how realistic that machine gun fire was. The source of the confusion is when something is said, how solid is it, and what is the scope for figuring out what the consequences will be, and add a little bit of trickiness, how unpredictable this is.
So, do you
Yeah.
think that there's something about the psychology of a gamer or the personality of a gamer that kind of shapes that understanding? Like, I guess it's
Yeah.
kind of a fancy way of saying you game with people who you like, or you game with people who have a like understanding.
There's a shared,
It may even
yeah,
apply to rule sets.
there's a shared aesthetic, certainly, that's necessary. There's also, but I think it has more to do with communication than aesthetics. I think it has to do with understanding what that person said and how contingent it
Sure,
was, and
absolutely.
how much you both understand how that feeds into whatever other mechanisms you're using, whatever other procedures you're relying upon. For example, with the auto fire machine gun blast, I can say, you know, I unload, right? I unload, full auto, right? Here I go. And what do we do next? Now we have to back up and say, well, how do we handle it in this group and in this game? We have this particular rules text to consult. We have this particular set of interactions about the rules text. And that doesn't depend on how complicated or detailed the rules text is. That we could be playing a game like I don't know, pick the most loosey goosey, roll and talk game you want to, right? There's any of these games with incredibly wide open, well, you succeeded, now say what happened. Nothing else. Nothing else to consult. It could have been drawing a picture, it could have been unloading a machine gun, whatever. Any game of that kind. The kind that, often is considered to be a weak design. Sometimes they are. But let's take a game like that. Well, all that means is that we have consulted the rules, and the rules said, now work it out. And it might have been said, work it out by consensus, which I think is crap design, or it might have said something like, person to the left says, or whatever it says. But you should know when you're playing who says and what they considered to be a constraint. In another text entirely, you had your table, whether it was a critical or not, whether you sprayed all the hexes, that you were pointing at, the various characters made their, dive for cover rolls or failed them, all kinds of subroutines that you've used. But all those is just subdivisions of potential constraints on how to talk, because it doesn't happen until someone says. And so that's why the medium is composed of talking, and all the things that we typically call rules are self-imposed and accepted constraints, which are, of course, usually subjected to considerable massaging, so that what we actually use as the constraints deviates from the text, frequently. So,
Oh, sure.
right. So, but the point is that even knowing that that happens, you looked, you thought about it, you massaged it, and said it. Somebody said it. And so, that really is, I think, the best way to understand the rules of a role-playing game. The notion that we have constraints on timing of actions, announcement of actions, resolution of actions, the effects of actions. We have constraints on those things, and that we use them because we like those constraints. There are so many different ones with different degrees of unpredictability, different degrees of distributed talking, different degrees of unknowns and unknowns, right? We have so many of them that we can choose. And that historically there have been, a lot available, just not that many visible. Not really that many visible. Here, you can't say, well, Dungeons and Dragons is the market leader. Dungeons and Dragons is the big success. As I've pointed out multiple times, much to the fury of most listeners, the Dungeons and Dragons till very recently was an albatross on anyone who owned it, and destroyed them. Just destroyed them. I mean, they sunk an immense amount of money into it every single time, and it ruined them every single time. And the only reason it was considered, like this big success was simply from the captive audience of role players in the game stores who have nothing better to do than to listen to what the store owner, no offense,
Oh,
operating,
no, no, I get
operating
it.
out of sunk cost debt and desperation is going to tell them is the thing they need to buy, right? And so,
Sure.
I guess what I'm saying is, therefore, you can say, I don't know if what you want to say. I mean, but there's a disconnect. There's a discontinuity again between the perceived leaders or most important or most prevalent games and what actually is, the
Right.
operational
Yeah.
games. The
This is a kind of a big point for me because I think it ties into the whole RPG perception thing about things like D&D being perceived as the industry leader because it's a great game. I think it was
right.
Adam Coble that said, he feels like Burning Wheel is a much better game because in the rules itself, it has written what you do in the game, whereas in D&D play is facilitated. We call it a role-playing game, but there's actually not a lot of rules text, especially if you're talking about pre-fifth edition. There's not a lot of rules text about actual role playing.
There's
It's the
I
mechanics of
yeah.
fighting and getting treasure.
I maintain that fourth edition has some of the best text about that, but nobody seems to have read those portions of the text except me. So,
Yeah.
but that aside, I will also, but that leads us to the difficult thing of people referring then to what they do at the table. and telling you that if you are so silly as to look at the book, then you obviously don't understand that, if you'd only encountered the essence at the table, you would be fine. Or as others will tell you, if you only feel it in your heart, then, you'll be fine. And so the idea is that, okay, first of all, I'm agreeing with you that, the basic point about industry leader, what does that even mean? That kind of thing. But
Sure.
I also want to point out that when we talk about the reality of role playing, this is where things are difficult for the audience you're talking to. It's what I've been driving at this whole topic right now is
Hmm.
it's not really the same as picking up a board game and playing
Right.
the board game. This is much more like picking up a paint set, or even more so, and this is my big analogy, a musical instrument or set of musical instruments,
Yeah.
particularly a combo that everybody at the table will have different instruments, by which I mean different characters, but even more importantly, different kinds of modes of contribution. Your basic dungeon crawl game, every single person at that table has different ways to contribute about different aspects of what's imagined. And that is very much like playing different musical instruments. But that's all it is. It's the musical instruments.
Right. It almost sounds like you're getting at that there's a particular game presents players with two two contributions: the fluff itself, the whether it's a sci-fi game, whether it's Star Trek, whether it's D&D, whether
I'd
it's
say topic.
Metamorphosis Alpha.
Sometimes that's important in and of itself. So
Topic, yeah.
topic, yeah.
Or idiom, maybe, is that one of the words you used recently?
Let's not drag Edwardsian chit chat of terms into all this. I mean,
I
for our
got you.
purposes right
So
now,
there's
topic
that
is good,
stuff.
right? Yeah. Hmm.
So there's that stuff, your topic, and then there's the actual system itself. The system also being a set of instruments that it gives players to produce a particular kind of role playing experience or a
Right.
particular understanding of the role playing game itself.
Precisely. Now, the tricky part about that is that, um, again, if we were playing, the analogy does work. If we were playing a symphony or off of sheet music or something like that in order to reproduce something. So if we were to reproduce something that has been envisioned, something that has been composed, that would be one thing. And we can find attempts at precisely that in role playing. I think Call of Cthulhu has struggled with that as an issue its entire existence. Are you
Hmm.
there to recreate these short stories and novellas as we know them, with perhaps, different top hats on? Or are you doing Lovecraftian fiction de novo? I mean, even with the same
Sure.
components, but de novo, you are forging into whatever this story becomes.
Right.
And that's a very difficult question for Call of Cthulhu, and you will find extremes, particularly of the first, available at many conventions, where play has become not distinguishable from theater. And here's your part. So,
Absolutely.
and then I think that the primary publishing model from the mid 80s through 2000 or so was also along those lines. Keep buying the meta plot supplements of what happens next. Keep running the players through this. After they defeat the ghouls, then they find out about the thing. The adventures walk you through. And there's, I usually quote or cite Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, second edition, Shadowrun, and the bulk of the White Wolf material, as the big representatives of this. FASA was the same for its other products, so I shouldn't just say Shadowrun. It was the same thing for Earth Dawn and so on. The
Sure.
general sense that whatever, when people say, "Oh, but we would play to find out what happens," play to teach. No, that they weren't doing any such thing. They were, or rather,
Right.
the texts were not built to do any such things. The text was very transitive. So so that is one way to do. When they say, well, what do we do with this system? Whereas the notion that whatever happens, happens is the opposite. It is, for lack of a better word, trusting to ourselves and trusting to the system in question that your purposes will be met, whatever those purposes are, they will be met. And I find that, I mean, most of my writings concern that possibility, that you use the system experientially and uh, without it being a fake, that you just like Jesus is coming, look busy, everybody just kind of rolls dice because you roll dice. And instead of doing that, while somebody tells you what happens and the story rolls on, instead you're actually making this happen. I can ask people about this and they say, oh yeah, we do that. And then I show them Sorcerer and they scream and run because it really does that. And so, and I've seen any number of people who were very excited about Sorcerer completely sprawl when the safety nets of the story shall go on and your character will come to the climax of the story are gone. This is where the goals and the mechanisms become very, very intertwined. And so again, it's more dials to spin, not just topic, not just purpose, but now mechanism. Are we going to do something where we trade off authorities about who says what? Or is it going to be fixed? I get to say my authorities about this throughout play, which is easier, you know. Or is it going to be, diversified in some way? So those are actually three things that are really different. So when you say game to game to game, you're not going to really be able to suss that out from the book itself.
Sure.
That's the other problem. I mean, games claim that they're about this or that all the time.
Right.
39 Dark has lots of text in it about winning, but it sure is not any kind of competitive game. Whereas, to cite the earlier White Wolf publications, which were extremely adamant that they were about creating stories, well, as soon as you kind of got into the thick of playing them, and as soon as you started getting the scenarios, you quickly realized, no, it's not about creating a story at all. That's been done. So,
right.
So therefore you can't really trust the texts in terms of
It seems like
casual
this
language.
is something that a lot of players, by and large, don't even recognize because,
Yeah.
and I'm not quite sure what the reason is behind it, other than maybe they rely so much on the games that have a game master. There's so much emphasis put on that game master kind of running the show, as it were. So when they do these games like White Wolf, Dungeons and Dragons, whatever, that are very scenario
Mm-hmm.
focused. So you have all these products to create this story.
Mm-hmm.
They don't necessarily see that, even if it's being waved in front of them. Here's the adventure module you're on,
Right.
and I'm going to run that. And they're
Right.
like, okay,
Right. No, I agree.
an illusion.
Yeah. So yeah,
That's
let's
all
take
good.
a look at this difficulty with grappling with this topic. And I wouldn't want to inflict this on your audience in any way, but maybe it's good to kind of backstop it because it's really shocking how quickly it'll emerge out of the audience when,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
blindside you. And the argument here is very tricky. One is, and this is by far the most common, is to say, well, there isn't any such purpose. We do it to do it. We love the medium. We want to be in the medium. I just want to play my character. I just want to be in the situation. I just want to imagine. A word that is used for this in the hobby is explore. I want to explore. And it sounds so straightforward, but frankly, it doesn't mean anything. What they're saying is that they love the medium and they value the medium when it's successful. A cynical person would say that in many groups, actually achieving the medium in the first place has been so problematic that now they're obsessed with it and say it's their priority. A more sympathetic view would say, well, yes, the person does love the medium, which I can understand because I love the medium. I get that. So that's the first thing, though, is that when you say purpose of play, they will say it's about establishing the medium. And if you think about it, with a medium that is this intangible, it's not oil on canvas, you can see how that would seem like a priority, you know? And I'm not even saying it's very delicate, but I am saying that it is not, you know, it's not in a box. The medium is not in the book. It's not in the box. It's not on the table. All that is instrumentation, but none of that is the actual stuff of the produced material. So, therefore, you can see why people would confuse the medium itself for a purpose. But my observation, argue as one might, I'm only speaking for myself. My argument is that whenever I see people with a successful medium, they're doing something with it that I can actually recognize as a human purpose. I can see what I call story now. I can see what I call step on up. I can, it's not mysterious. I'm not looking into their secret motivations. You know, I can, and they'll say, but I didn't mean to, but I didn't plan on it, but we didn't talk about it. I didn't reflect on it. And I would say, of course not. No one ever does. No one goes off and plays volleyball and reflects on the nature of competition first and has like a tedious discussion section beforehand about exactly what, you know, this is. No, of course not. And so it is very similar in this regard. You don't have to have any such discussion. However, we observe the importance of this by watching it when it fails. The medium breakdown, purpose breakdown are hard to distinguish from one another. I think they are different, but they often go together. So, but you can see it fail. You can see it when the group isn't having fun making the medium. You can see when the
Yeah,
group isn't
absolutely.
having fun because people are dialing back their purpose of play just to get along, or are determined on whatever purpose they want everybody to be doing, and the others, you know, inexplicably are not. Because when I say purpose of play, and everyone gets this confused about my whole creative agenda thing, that's why I try to phrase it totally different in phenomenology. I'm not talking about internal experiences. In one of the discussions I have at Its Play, this was one of our conversations about the D&D religion thing, and he talked about how when he was playing, he could tell that his friend, his longtime fellow role player, was always very invested in the emotional rising action and what we would think of as the emergent arc of a character and of the situation. So he could say, I look right at him and I see your whole story now thing right in front of my face. You know, he's making it happen, he's watching it happen, he's experiencing it as it happens, you know, it's all there. And he says, I don't really have any great motivation about that. I don't really feel it. And I thought to myself afterward, and I said, I see the problem. The point is that they play together successfully. I wouldn't be interested in what's happening separately and divisibly between the two of them. I'm interested in the strong overlap when it comes to shared material. What do they say and listen to between each other? And if that consistently feeds into that rising arc and whatever, then the second guy is doing the same thing too. You see what I mean? I mean, if you're looking at what actually occurs in the fiction along the way and the way we use the system to do it, and we agree and enjoy how the system is doing it, then consulting one's interior space is of no interest whatsoever. It's completely
Right.
irrelevant. I mean, it may not be irrelevant
It's a
causally.
point you made in one of your videos, that there's kind of a recursive component to RPGs, which seems to be really significant, where it's not just about someone saying something and doing something with their character as much as it is something gets said and it gets processed by
Right.
the other people there, and then
Mm-hmm.
it evolves
Yeah,
and creates a vivid experience.
I agree. I mean, clearly, I agree. This is where we are working on this devices, these rule sets, or these topics of interest. Going back to the topic, it's not trivial because if you're not creatively interested in that topic, then, you know, you can't play it. You have to be
Sure.
creatively interested in it. And you can, I will even go so far as to say when somebody goes along to get along just to be at the table and really doesn't care about that topic, they don't really care at all about that topic, then it really they really shouldn't be there. They're really not helping. They make life more difficult rather than less difficult. And
Sure.
the however, it's tricky because somebody who says they're not interested in the topic may become interested in some aspect of play, and you'd be happy after all, to engage with the topic to do that. Like they say they're really interested in a given romance or something like that. And so you can't really tell ahead of time. Um, there's also the tricky thing of people who say that they're fanatics or devoted to a given topic, but they're only really devoted to it as a source material in some other medium. And therefore, their capacity to engage with it as a role playing topic is actually pretty limited.
They're in
That
love with the idea of it, not the actuality of it.
Right, right. Well, they're interested in what the TV show did or what the movie did, and it's one of the problems we talked about with licensed games. Some licensed games are tremendous, really, really good. Others, you're kind of like, well, really, does anybody want to play this, or do they like having it because they like the show? I mean, they're reading it basically to just sort of have somebody to talk to about the show some more.
And couldn't the
You know.
same be said of game mechanics as well? That
Mhm.
especially game masters or serious role playing enthusiasts, they'll buy a
Oh yeah.
system or a set of rules just because they are interested in that set of rules. They may not even have any intention of playing it. I unfortunately fall into this
For
a lot.
well, this is there's a of course a gray area because there are those people who would if they could,
Sure.
and when I was able to ramp up my role playing dramatically in the early 90s, the first thing I did was drag stuff off my shelves and say we're playing it, and someone says that's a dead game, and I'm like, eat me. It's not dead if we're playing it. It's not, you know. And
Right.
so the and that's a big deal for me actually. There are a number of people who would if they could with all these games. There are others who really I will be a little cynical here. A person who meets the profile of what you talked about to a very large extent. And I do think that there's a lot in the hobby, and it's been acknowledged for a long time. I was told around 2000s, never mind designing Sorcerer anymore. That all my design work on it was just wasted. I should give up on that, get a clue. Nobody plays. Just make the thing fun to read. That's what it is. You're just selling you're just selling basically, daydream material for someone that the role-playing game as an activity only exists as an internal medium for somebody reading the book to pretend or dream that they're doing it. Because it's never going to happen because they all suck in reality. This person was very cynical about the hobby. This person was also
Yeah.
extremely influential and economically important in the hobby. The person had literally no love, no trust, no interest, no credence that this ever actually really happened out there
Wow.
among humans. So that's really the extreme case, right? And so a person who conforms a bit more to that, well, there's a dissatisfaction issue. There's the game that everybody insists on playing because they identify with it and they feel comfortable with it, maybe not because they enjoy it very much, but because this is how they identify with their socializing. And they fear, doing anything else because for one thing it's effort, they have to learn all this crap. And then but the point is that therefore our intrepid purchaser is going to buy more things because at least that's the only way that they can maybe look for more satisfaction is in imagining play. That's kind of sad. That's where you have a person who's kind of trapped, trapped in their social scene, trapped in their play identity, and sort of sadly leafing through the books hoping one day to play this or that game. And or you also have the situation where um, a person believes that there really is only one way to role play, and that therefore everything out there is just more source books.
see a lot of that.
Yeah, and that happens too. I mean, and they're the ones who insist that they've played a dozen systems, and then you ask what they are, and they're all basically just variants on the same game published by multiple
Sure.
people. But and so you have a rather a rather difficult time. A lot of ways to get in that situation where purchasing and library building are kind of the main focus, the main observed behavior. Um, I have an enormous role playing library. I mean, like a lot of us, and I pride myself that I tried at least to read all of it with a practical eye. That
Sure.
even if I don't have plans to play one day, I could. I could, and I will at least give the game credit for some possibility of playability. Um, there are some texts which defeat me. I read it and I'm like, I just cannot see this, going well. If I
Absolutely.
skin it to this vague game that we really play at the table, then sure. But that's not what we're talking about. If I actually try to engage with the way this thing allegedly works, I don't think anybody ever actually played this thing. I think somebody stuffed a bunch of nutsy stuff in there, whatever. But I think that for purposes of a conversation and for purposes of the audience you're talking about, if they're coming to your talk, then they're probably more interested in play as a phenomenon than compensatory behavior for not being able to play, you know.
Yeah, I
So if
agree.
that's so therefore we don't really have to, for purposes of the talk, that topic becomes less, difficult.
Sure.
The which is good because otherwise it's either depressing or and let's go ahead and give credit.
It's a
Maybe
different
somebody is,
talk.
yeah, exactly. Maybe somebody is happily playing away on game X, and that's that, and they buy the other games because they kind of just like thinking about it off the cuff, and that's that, and everything is happy. Maybe there's someone out there who fits that bill that I've just been insulting by accident, all this time just now, and you know I don't know. I've met some pretty unhappy people who fit that. Or if not
Oh yeah.
unhappy, then just a little bit disgruntled that they're not getting the chance that somehow, Um, and that's one thing about Adept's Play I'm hoping to make available is that, yeah, we can play. I'm here. Other people are here. People meet each other. We can, get a chance to play. What, out of curiosity, Ken, is there a fave off your shelf that you thumb a little too often and say, man, never got whenever or played it a little but never got back to it, or never played
Oh,
it.
so if there's one that we're saying, uh, I love the idea of playing it, but I haven't yet, then oh man, I think it would be The White Hack by
Interesting. Yeah.
Christian Marston.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, I love reading that book, and it really seems to emulate in a weird way what when I talk to people that played with Gary and Dave, before D&D and as D&D evolved and thereafter, um, a lot of the play style from that time period seems to be kind of encapsulated in this kind of a modern esque
Right.
OSR rule set, right?
Right.
Um, so yeah, I'm real fascinated by that game. Yeah, that's the one that I would really like to take off
Right.
the shelf, bring to my group, and go, "Hey guys, we got to do this."
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think that's probably the trick. Now, if we're talking about RPGs that I'm currently hypnotized by and can't get away from, John Stone Metzger's Space Worm versus Moonicorn, we are just entranced with
Oh,
at the
really?
moment.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's a really fascinating little play for sure.
Interesting, because I don't know it very
And,
well at all.
it's a dungeon world
Okay.
um, extension, so that's really all it is. The twist on Space Worm versus Moonicorn is there's a winner.
Mm-hmm.
So there are two principal protagonists, which is Space Worm, the most powerful person in the universe, and then there's Moonicorn. who is the ultimate romantic rebel. All the other players
Thanos and
involved
Adam
at the
Warlock.
table,
Yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
all the other players are support characters, as it were, and they are going to wind up perhaps siding with one of the other two. So it's kind of a sci-fi drama, a space opera unfolding at the table where the central conflict and tension is really between the players. So it's kind of fun. But then you have the GM who steps in. He's trying to uh, see whether or not maybe both Space Worm and Moonicorn lose the game.
Right.
There are fronts presented in the book that the GM uses that if they are defeated by one or the other, they kind of get points towards winning, as it were. But if they don't, then the the whole premise can be defeated
Right. Right. Right.
by the protagonist. So,
Right.
so yeah, that's
Right.
kind of
So the
what the
game,
groove is at the moment
the
in my groove.
I like that. The GM as I'm this is kind of ridiculous, but I'm thinking of those really really overblown tournament duels in bad martial
Oh
arts
yeah,
movies where like the mastermind of the tournament like sets off the flame jets and stuff like that, every so often.
absolutely.
But okay, so um, how about last bit of this little diversion? Any older games?
Older games. Well, I definitely dip my toes back into D&D. That's where I have my roots, I guess it
Hmm.
were. First RPG I ever played, I ran, and it's the one that inevitably I keep coming back to. With my older gamers, that sort of
Which
thing.
one did you start with? What edition was it? What authors do you know?
Uh, I started with. It was weird. I bought the expert rule set, um, and
Mulgay, right?
thinking
Hmm.
that knowing nothing about the game, I skipped the basic and I said, well, I need expert because I'm that good. I'm 13 years old, right? But then, of course, I went back and got basic when I realized, oh, I can't really run with this because I need that first part. And so that was it. The basic and expert rule set. And then I moved almost immediately within a year to advanced D&D.
Um,
So
yeah.
that was my go-to
Hmm. So the
for sure.
so that's what you did, yeah. But what about ones that you didn't play that that you looked at and
Right.
maybe bought and never did?
Wow, that's of the older stuff. That's a hard one, Ron. I almost always play
That's a good thing, though.
the stuff
That's
I
a
buy,
good
which is
thing.
weird.
No, that I think that's fantastic. I mean, that's yeah.
Yeah, I would say definitely the I think it was the Falsa Mech Warrior role playing
Ah,
game
right.
that
Hmm.
was
Hmm.
a direct. It was really a distillation of the miniature games, but presented as a role playing game. And I always wanted to do that, but I never did.
It more of those are good than I think they get credit for. Um,
Yeah,
there
I
are,
think so.
I mean, the the one I'm thinking of is a part of a vast franchise and multiple different incarnations. Um, but the mid '90s Mutant Chronicles from Heartbreaker
Hmm.
was I always go back to that text and a couple of its supplements and thumb through it and say, there's some really good dystopic science fiction in here. You know, there's real science
Hmm.
fiction horror if we can do it, and and a lot of it leans that way. The text leans toward sort of a human acknowledgement of the dystopic society and the horror. It's not just militaristic demon shooting. So
Right.
you're kind of going, huh, this is really interesting. So, and I know that there's a huge line of fiction associated with it. It's much bigger than the rule books that I have. But just looking at that one little nugget of stuff that's really just role playing, without any meta plot going on or anything like that, and saying, one of these days, I'm getting back to you. Um,
Oh yeah.
so what I'm saying though is that with a with a knowledge, a working, utterly practical knowledge that you can do this thing, that you and the people with you are capable of generating this medium, and that nobody's going to be either through competence or, you know, social personality or something is going to be a, you know, a real pain about that. You know, we're going to, if we sit down to play a game, there's going to be a goodwill effort toward making fictional time happen and keep happening. Really, if you think about it, that is the one thing that is the standard for any other kind of enjoyment or any other component of play. So if you have some trust in that, or trust that people that you're meeting through a certain venue will have that goodwill, like I'm encountering and have encountered for a while. If you do that, and then you say, now we're going to pick this thing up, or even if you don't, like when I pick up that game and I look at it and I say, I'm reading this in knowledge that I could. This is not what we call lonely fun, you know, that I'm substituting for play by reading this. I know that should, you know, the social scene and time and interest align, we could do this. And it is that sense of confidence in the practice, in the to be a practitioner, that is at the moment is kind of something you have to suss out. It's some kind of something you have to, you know, find in others, and it's not the same thing as being an experienced gamer, right? There, I mean, you can find. I often say the best practitioners are people who are just past the first part of the learning curve, you know,
Oh yeah.
and they are really really great contributors and very enthusiastic about the material. And in a working systemic context, very enthusiastic users of the available system. So, you know, so I'm not, so when I say practitioners, it's a really tricky thing. I often think about martial arts as an analogy, that regardless of quote level, you have the people in the social activity, in the larger societal practice. You have the minority of people, or, you know, component, certain portion of the people who mean it. And I don't necessarily mean that they're savage alley fighters. I just mean they mean it. Whatever it is, the way that they're doing martial arts is important to them, and they're enjoying it, and they are trying to get better. And they, you know, whether it's a, you know, competitive fighting, or whether it's self-defense training, or whether it's kind of a cultural arty thing that they like to do, or people who are interested for their health, or any of that, but they are serious. And that means that by definition they like working with other people who are doing the same thing. They like it. They are okay with meeting somebody. And I don't know if you have experience with that culture, but there is kind of a sussing out of whether the other person is somebody who takes this reasonably seriously.
Oh yeah.
And by
Yeah.
definition, yeah, by definition, it means that when you're going to be able on this floor, and often regardless of, you know, race, color, creed, religion, whatever, on this floor, we're going to get along, right? We're going to get along. This is going to be all right. And and of course, and I mentioned martial arts because it's embedded in a much larger societal practice where there are people, and unfortunately even teachers and institutions, that don't really foster that very much. You have to kind of cultivate it in yourself and find the other people who are doing the same. Does that make any sense? Is that,
It does.
yeah,
It
yeah.
does.
So at the moment, it's kind of, it's kind of hard to feel secure about. You have to kind of put yourself out there and be ready for a little disappointment once in a while.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. and
Absolutely.
and so so the social scene of role playing for fun, it kind of has that quality of, you know, well, here we are looking for each other, you know, here we are looking for the fun, looking, here we are organizing things, right? Because you have to kind of be an organizer to make it happen, at all. Somebody does. And so getting, I mean, I'm bringing this up because that's kind of relevant to your audience. You know, it's kind of tricky to say to them, oh, and guess
Yeah.
what? You know, oh, and guess what? When you go into the social space where this happens, a little bit of personal judgment about the way they do it here. Is that fun for me?
Yeah,
Right.
I definitely like the idea of presenting role playing games to the audience as a emphasizing that it's a social activity. Here's something you can do besides ballroom dancing, or going out
Mhm.
clubbing or something like that, or going to the movies. You can actually play a role playing game.
Right. It is an activity.
Interact.
You are doing it. And it's a little interesting to uh I mean, all these things work together because that goes with the idea that the topic doesn't govern it, right? That a given
Absolutely.
systemic approach, that using this kind of die or organizing things with this kind of game master and those kinds of players isn't a defining feature. It is merely an expression. It's the particular instrumentation, to use that analogy. It's a particular instrumentation of which there are many. So many, many topics, many, many instrumentations, and since it's just a medium, different purposes. So with
Sure.
all that in place, really, it's it's almost like, then you could say, well, you might have heard of Dungeons. I mean, I bet you already kind of have this in mind. I mean, you could say, I bet you heard of Dungeons and Dragons. Well, what about, click PowerPoint, and then wham, all these covers come up, or as topic,
Absolutely.
maybe you think of this, and then there's like the guys with their spears and the dragon and stuff like that saying that's great, everybody likes, heroic fantasy. That's great. But click, and then wham, all of the different images of all the different topics pop up. And some of them, as you know, startlingly different from just different ways to be in danger.
Oh,
It's not
absolutely.
just different fight scenes with different costumes. There's different conflicts at work. There's different. That's the other thing, man. All the different things. What about the scope of play? Somebody can ask a perfectly reasonable question. Well, how long do you play? I hear you play for years. I hear you don't have fun for like the first 8 months, and then it starts getting fun. You know, um, and
I hope that's not true.
well, I have a. Oh, I agree about that, but it reminds me of an extremely uncool analogy that I hope isn't offensive to you. That when people start smoking pot, they say they don't enjoy it, and then everybody else says, "Well, you're just not doing it right. Keep going." After you know. And so,
Oh yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, maybe leave that out of the talk. So, but we can get away from that, right? We can say, well, hold on, hold on. Some games are built to be a session. Some games end opportunistically. You don't know when it will be session by session, but there is, end states. There are other games in which endings are kind of voluntary. You'll find that the game itself doesn't have a designated ending, but there are such things as fictional stopping points in which people take it upon themselves to say, okay, we did it. All those things are, you know, all those things are allowable. All those things are the notion of kind of the enter this realm of activity, and you're kind of stuck doing it like flypaper forever because it never
Sure.
ends. Well, it's a kind of a good question. You can acknowledge there are people who have played in the same game, pretty much the same group, and using the same fictional, time sequence for a really long time. But even those have interesting breakpoints when they switched system, or when the group composition changed dramatically, or when they took a break for a year, or something. There are more breaks than I think people realize in these ongoing games.
Sure.
And so, so I guess what used to be I thought of as a selling point back when I was young, that the game never ends. In ordinary conversation, that's not much of a selling point. Would you sell a
You're
card
right.
game? Would you sell a card game that it never ends? And what's also kind of
That would be
interesting,
tough.
let's not forget about, if we go to the story-based media, if we talk about like an ongoing TV show, it's kind of interesting that there seems to be a double standard, or almost a cognitive dissonance, that you wish it would never end, and yet you acknowledge that they're always better when there is an end.
Right.
There's
I
a
find for me that this becomes more relevant as I get older, in that I'm looking for games that actually facilitate faster play, where we can hack more into a shorter amount of time and still get that same dynamic
Well, yeah,
experience
that's
of
the other issue
longer
for
play.
sure. That's definitely an important issue. Is uh uh okay. Well, the cruel phrase that I believe is attributed to Ryan Dancy, who, when they were working on third edition during the WotC purchase, and saying, well, we're going to do this thing. He
Hmm.
said the problem is that people are used to 20 minutes of fun packed into 4 hours,
Right.
which, as with so many things Dancy said, was not a popular thing to say, and gained immense pushback, but sadly was often accurate. So
Sure.
you have this question: yes, is this activity freaking fun? And I think that instead of pointing fingers at any given system, pointing fingers at any given subculture, although I do tend to fall into that trap in both cases, um, we don't even have to do that. You can flip it around and say, okay, for you, what would be the fun? Are you happier with it being a session? Are you happier with several meetings over the course of time? Are you happier with it more like a weekly poker night where it does go on and on and on, with units of enjoyment? We're talking about the scope of play. You can have successful
Mm.
play that's very long. You can, and multi part. You can have successful play that's very short. You can have successful play that is concerned with character survival, and successful play that's not. There's some pretty, you know, there's some pretty broad scope for the human effort, the human timescale of interaction there.
You you frequently touch on what's really kind of a cultural anthropology about role playing gamers, that there are a set of folkways and mores that they are bringing to the table. And they are not, it's not something that's spoken necessarily, but
Mhm.
it provides a structure for role playing games. And that kind of fascinates me, because I wonder if that hasn't been going on since, the very
Oh, I
beginning
totally
and
think it's been going
continues
on.
to this day.
I totally think that's the case. And then I become interested in its diversification. And also, one of the things that makes me kind of not a cultural anthropologist is that I don't do the thing, well, where it's all diverse and it's all alike at the same time. Instead, I'd say,
Yeah.
well, no, actually, we do see different purposes. We do see different kinds of instrumentation that people can arrive at preferences for, and that's
Right.
okay. That diversification that I'm talking about is not merely rearranging the same components for the same ends. And that would be the system doesn't matter mantra. Yeah,
Right.
there are different systems, but so what? It's all just role playing. All you need is a this, all you need is a that. And I, of course, am arguing very differently that the different purposes and the different instrumentations yield different experiences,
Sure.
and that's a good thing. That
Yeah.
that to me is it's fascinating, it's fun, and once you get certain itches scratched, certain needs or desired purposes met, certain familiar ground or desired familiar ground is you become a practitioner of it. I've noticed a lot of us have just kind of breathed in and out at that point and said, huh, maybe I will try something else. Maybe I will try something else now and see what it's like. All of a sudden I realize it's not any skin off of anybody's nose for me to play a different game for a bit, and I mean a really different game. It's okay. Um, and that's a door people get through. If I still find people talking in terms of loyalty to either a title or to a concept, like old school D&D, some concept, or diceless, story gaming, whatever it is, any of these labels, they're interested in loyalty to that thing. Then either their interest in that is of no interest to me whatsoever because it's just loyalty and subcultural identity games, or that loyalty is because they're still working out and or maybe achieving the satisfaction they desired from that. In which case, I have no kick about that. They're involved in that. But a lot of people who do get that in the fullness of time shake their heads a little bit and then say, okay, why was I so loyal? Well, I guess I was back then, but right now
Yeah.
I'm good, you know. I'm good. I get what I want out of that and I can always do it again. So in the meantime, what's that thing over there? All you people keep talking about, what is that after all? You know? And so,
Yeah, I wonder if
yeah.
more and more people might come to that conclusion. I mean, I know I did. I mean, I was a pretty serious D20 person for a long time, even though I played other things. But really, it wasn't until kind of, I guess, this new modern era, if you will, of RPGs where you've got the PBTA games and
Hmm.
everything that's kind of spinning around from that. Uh, those are seem to be very different perspectives, or they're giving something
What's,
different.
yeah, from my perspective, I actually find the current array of Fate and Powered by the Apocalypse and
Right.
a few others, but I'm actually finding that array fairly limited because I was in the underground's eruption and
Yeah.
exposure and development of the foundations, for some of those. And so when I look at Le Monde Marie and 100 games that are in some ways like it because of those qualities that we talked about, but in every other possible way unlike it because they are their own things.
Right.
When I look at that array, I say, well, actually, I'm actually kind of still in the street. You know, I'm kind of still in the crazy man zone where I'm, playing those, and then I'm reaching back on the shelves and pulling out, uh, you know, tons and tons of games that probably people think only exist as Wikipedia entries at most, and enjoying them. So, I really get into the diversity of it.
For
Well,
sure.
what I'm going to suggest, actually, I don't know if I'm going to have the time or if you will, but it might be kind of interesting to play a little Le Monde Marie over
Oh,
Discord.
yes,
Actually play it
definitely.
and see what comes of it.
Absolutely.
And then that could be a very interesting sort of follow up on your talk for people who continue. And you say, well, people would say, well, wait a minute, how far do these things really go? And you're kind of like, well, you know,
They go quite
yeah.
far.
So yeah. But that leads to a point that was made about comics 20 years ago, which is huge. Page 45. Are you familiar with that store in England? They had a really important point that
I
they
don't
made.
guess so.
Yeah, they made a really important point that they made back then, which was that they decided to flip the term mainstream when it came to comics. They said in every other medium, mainstream means horror, history, comedy, science fiction and fantasy, sex, all that stuff. Mainstream means all those things in any combination. And particular topics based arcane nuggets are the ones that are considered fringe, a particular fandom in a particular thing or show or title or whatever. That's how it is for everything except comics. In comics, we say superheroes are mainstream, and all those other things are the fringe. That makes no sense. And
There's a
and
double
it's
standard
yeah,
somewhere.
it doesn't make any sense commercially. No wonder Here, let's do a comic book store that flips it. We're going to have all the mainstream stuff be mainstream and be the contacts that you come into when you walk in the store, and the superheroes are going to be their niche little specialty over there on that shelf.
Right.
And we're going to run the store like people run, good bookstores or good, you know, pop culture emporia, and, talk to people and be real good with people who come in who are kind of interested. What do you
Absolutely.
like? Well, I kind of like Stephen King. Oh, well, we got those comics over here. Check it out. What do you like? Oh, well, I kind of like this, those, you know, he might somebody might mention like funny sex comedies, of which there are
Yeah.
thousands and are considered perfectly normal, right? Not bad at all,
Absolutely.
right? And the person says, "We got your comics right here."
Yeah.
Someone else says,
Yeah.
I,
That
I
is
read
a
I read
frequent.
romance novels. We got your comics right here, you know. And
Yeah.
so it's
That's a frequent approach of mine to
yeah,
people that are new to comics is to
yeah,
ask them, well, what kind of books do you read? What kind of movies do you watch? What kind of television
right,
do you watch? And then, yeah,
yeah.
it's
And
pretty
so
easy to start singling out stuff.
exactly. And so but part of that is to sort of get over the idea that mainstream comics are this one topic. And
Right.
so if and so it's the same thing with role playing. That's what I'm really getting at. It's the same thing with role playing.
Hmm.
You just don't have to be topic driven. And that's one thing which has changed. Uh, I would, if I could, probably come up with several publications right around 2000 through 2004, with a couple of things prefiguring them. But I could come up with some that really said we are going where we will with this topic.
Oh, yeah.
And so the medium is the medium. When we will do this topic, um, as we will with this medium, and never mind what you think role playing is. And those games and those play practices, I think, were mainstream in
Yeah, I
that
think you're
sense.
right.
So that's
There's
really,
definitely
yeah.
some innovative stuff from there. Well, let's not use the word innovative.
Let's just say
Different.
diverse and intriguing to a wider
Yeah,
audience than anybody thought, right? I mean, if
absolutely.
it's kind of funny. I mean, innovative usually means a highly specialized audience, but here we're talking about things that suddenly break the stuff open to a whole bunch of people. So I
Absolutely.
actually, I actually might. Sometimes it was taking stuff that was in role playing games, but had been perhaps a little straitjacketed through specific publications and specific habits. Other times it was just something freakily brand new. Um, or taking a familiar pop culture thing, putting it into role playing in a way that hadn't been done. Jared Sorensen's Inspectors is a really, really super good example of that.
Yeah,
So, anyways, new things to do, kids to check, dinner to have.
absolutely.
This was a real pleasure, and I hope you enjoyed it.
I
So,
did.
yeah,
Again, I appreciate it, Ron, and I'll definitely update you on what happens, and
right. When is the
we'll
talk
give
scheduled
Lamont
for?
Marie a chance
Yeah,
too.
when's the talk scheduled?
That's going to be in the end of July.
Seems like it's a long way away, but speaking as somebody who just
It is a long way away. It gives me a
yeah.
chance to prep.
Yeah. On the other hand, speaking as somebody who just realized when his kid's school year ends and saying, "What? Wait, that's like soon." Right? Somebody
Very
who
soon.
just had that experience, I can say, it is coming. So, all right. Take care, and I will talk to you later on. Please feel free to comment anything you want at its play if you ever get the chance. You know.
I'll
So,
do it.
yeah. Take care, man. See ya.
All right. Thanks, Ron.